Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started right away since this is recorded and people can back up and we'll get to the content. For those who don't know me, I'm Lucas Sjostrom, Executive Director of the Minnesota Milk Producers Association. I grew up on a dairy farm, have an education in animal science, and continue to live on a dairy farm today. But despite my background, I rely heavily on the others you will hear from today on animal and human science we're learning in regard to the H5N1 situation. And then I'm also learning from our farmer members and farmers, dairy farmers generally, about how to do the best we can to keep farmers operating. So I want to acknowledge from the start concern and frustration conveyed by many farmers who have reached out. We certainly understand and appreciate the challenges this disease and the federal order present to our producers. And I want to say I'm confident in the people and agencies we have handling this ever-evolving situation. I'm also confident in our farmers who have been resilient and committed to solutions through this and other challenges. We've been discussing and preparing actually for some time in Minnesota how to respond to animal disease outbreaks. I'm proud to say we have the people and infrastructure to think about and act upon this, and we've been working for years, really, meeting several times during my tenure to prepare for times like this. We have a yearly gathering where we just all introduce ourselves and share what we're working on, and that's really helped us to know who to call, when, where, how they live and work, and that really, for me, I think has built a lot of trust amongst this community. So I appreciate the state and other leaders, university and USDA APHIS, allowing me to open this call today. And so again, I'll say I knew all the people on this call before this news was coming out, and I can say we as Minnesota are leaders, along with our neighbors, as we've been meeting weekly since we heard kind of this new syndrome coming forward. And those meetings are with similar officials in surrounding states, your state of Minnesota officials, University of Minnesota, including research, the Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, Extension, and other officials, including Dr. Holzbauer from USDA APHIS, who isn't presenting on this call today, but has participated with us regularly. And they've all been exemplary, providing advice and counsel to all of us. So please know that all of us are working together diligently to improve guidance, improve rules, improve regulations for our livestock, our farmers, our workers, and ultimately the shipment of milk. And we'll continue to share resources as we can from these respective agency websites, which I'm sure they will both cite and update, and also through the Minnesota Milk e-newsletter, our social media, our website, and our print newsletter as we deem appropriate. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Joe Armstrong with University of Minnesota Extension, and we will save up your questions to answer at the end after the presenters have gone through. Dr. Armstrong, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lucas. So my job today is kind of go over where we are now, what we're seeing in cattle, what we're seeing in herds. Let's start with what we see in cattle first. So the first sign that we're seeing is a drop in feed intake. That drop in feed intake is followed shortly by a drop in milk production as well. The drop in feed intake originally was reported as mostly the virus impacting mid to late lactation animals and second lactation and greater. We now know that that is one of the most impacted populations, but it is not the only impacted population on the farms. So we need to be looking at all of our animals, looking at feed intakes, milk production, signs of the disease. Other things to look for: some cattle have diarrhea. Many cattle have tacky or dry manure. They have almost no milk. Sometimes that milk in severe cases is looking more like colostrum than regular milk, yellow, thicker. Some of the cattle have fevers. Many of the cattle have clear nasal discharge as well, and they look just lethargic and off and dumpy. That is that overt clinical signs in those cattle that need to be pulled and treated with supportive care. That's usually about 5% of the total milking herd per day. So if we think about a 5,000 cow dairy, that means you're going to have between 200 and 300 animals that need supportive care every day that you're dealing with this. Individual signs in cattle last about 3 to 5 days at their peak. The herd is impacted overall for about 14 to 21 days. We see a gradual drop in feed intakes over a 10 to 12 day period, and then they slowly ramp back up all the way out to around 14 to 21 days and return to almost normal when it comes to milk production and feed intakes. We do have confirmed cow-to-cow transmission, and that is part of why the federal order came out. We have cow-to-cow transmission and enough data to say that movement of cattle can be spreading the disease. In addition to that, USDA has confirmed that there is some evidence to show that impacted and affected dairy herds that are infected with the virus could be a risk to nearby poultry farms. So that's another reason that the federal order came out. There's no reported cases in Minnesota yet. We have one reported case in Texas of a human that was tested positive for the virus and had conjunctivitis. That human is fine, recovered just fine. I'll leave more of the human discussion for Dr. Holzbauer. Recently, in our latest updates from FDA, they did test shelf milk for the virus with PCR, and it did test positive. The important thing to note when we talk about PCR testing is that PCR testing does not allow us to comment about the viability of the virus. So when we have positive PCR tests, it does not say anything about the infectivity of the virus. And likely what is happening is that pasteurization inactivated the virus, and PCR is still testing positive, even though that virus is not a danger to anyone. And we only have viral fragments in that milk. So FDA is continuing to say that there's no concern about the commercial milk supply and that milk is safe. We also have preliminary data from NIH showing us that milk is safe and pasteurization is working. Okay, and then most recently on Wednesday, we have our federal order that was put out saying that USDA will be requiring our pre-movement testing for all lactating dairy cattle that are crossing state lines. They recently, like in the last 20 minutes, put out the guidance document that tells us the details. I think I will leave the guidance document for now. I've only read it through once. There's plenty to digest, and we'll see if I can glean some more from that as we go. As far as further updates, that's all I have for right now as far as what you should be looking for and the kind of the progression of this. Again, no reported cases in Minnesota at this time, and only the one reported human case in Texas, and that was almost a month ago. And I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Next, we'll have Dr. Cornille, I believe, from the Board of Animal Health. And I'll let you introduce yourself further, Katie. Please go ahead.
Absolutely. Hello, hello. So I'm Dr. Katie Cornille. I'm a senior veterinarian at the Board of Animal Health, and I oversee cattle disease programs, bovine disease programs, as well as animal disease traceability and a few other things. So you got a little bit of a timeline in the case profile from Dr. Armstrong. So thank you for that. And, you know, as we've seen in terms of detections of H5N1 in dairy cattle, you know, it was first confirmed in March 25 and been seen in 8 total states. And as we talked about, the past few days have seen those USDA orders and the published within the last hour the requirements and recommendations on that order, which will I've only gotten to glance through them, but will hopefully provide a little bit of extra clarity, and then through communication with, you know, USDA and everyone will be able to continue providing you with kind of details and information on how that would be implemented. So in terms of animal movements and traceability, so aside from anything that is in the federal order, there are currently still no changes to movement restrictions in Minnesota. So I know some other states that you may export to, they've added maybe some changes to their CVI or other requirements, but in Minnesota, we have confidence currently in our current traceability measures to provide us the information we need. So I just wanted to reiterate that there aren't any changes aside from the federal order in terms of Minnesota requirements for movements. So talking about a little bit, I'm talking about surveillance and movement, right? So this is a very moving target right now. So this is considered an emerging disease in U.S. cattle. An emerging disease is defined as an infectious disease that is newly recognized in either a population or maybe existed, but then is increasing at a rate greater than expected. So in this instance, it's considered an emerging disease because it's in a population. This virus is being seen in a population, i.e. cattle, that wasn't expected in a geographic area of the U.S. where it hadn't really been seen before. I think it will be shared kind of the sites that there are from USDA and CDC and FDA that kind of are posting all their updates that kind of are adding to the surveillance. So it's pretty quick that we're able to see any changes in development of detections and whatnot. And so again, talking surveillance. So the strategies that are going to be used are a lot of times depend on how the pathogen, in this case a virus, behaves. And there are still a lot of unknowns, and there's ongoing research and transmission, incubation, infectious period, all that stuff. And, we're getting new information day by day, but a lot of times that's what kind of the testing and those kind of strategies are based around. So this is going to be a little bit of a, fluid situation as we learn more information. As you all may have heard, so the sampling method that's kind of been determined to be the most effective for any type of this disease surveillance is through unpasteurized milk, because the virus tends to, like the cells that are in the mammary glands there. So that's where there's been the greatest detection of viral loads. So that's why these the sampling guidelines are for, milk as opposed to collecting blood or nasal swabs or something else. And again, with some of the unknowns, you'll see there's still a big emphasis placed on biosecurity in general, biosecurity and prevention overall of disease entering herds. And so unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the things I had planned to say now that we have new information in the last hour, I'm kind of going on the fly a little bit here. Or a lot of it. So Monday is when that interstate pre-movement testing for lactating dairy cattle is to go into place. And it was defined a little bit further that lactating is including early, mid, or late lactation. And there's a few things that I need clarification on, like are springing heifers included, because it looked like based on my quick reading of the guidance that maybe they're not, but again, these are things we're gonna hash out. It's also important to note that non-negative results from laboratories are reportable. So just like other reportable diseases, the state has to be notified. So then, if there's any, additional tracing or whatever we need to do, we can do that. And for this pre-movement testing, that needs to occur up to 7 days prior to the movement for those groups where it's required. There's also kind of guidance posted on recommended testing. So any herds that meet that case profile or that clinical picture that Dr. Armstrong shared, or I think USDA will also pay for pre-movement testing for non-lactating dairy cattle if producers want to know the status. So that will also be covered. And the samples to be collected pre-movement are individual samples from all quarters, and that's for 30 animals, or if there's fewer than 30 animals in the movement, on all animals, and those are individual samples. So they won't be, so they're not going to be pooled. In terms of who will be doing that sampling, again, I just saw in this document that, it looks like it has to be somebody under the supervision of an accredited veterinarian, and that is approved or in a manner approved by, the state veterinarian. So we'll hash out kind of what that means and that looks like. But the samples do have to go to a non-lab, which for us is our U of M veterinary diagnostic lab does qualify for that. And we've been working a lot with them to talk about, what that looks like in their capacity and the frequency and all that good stuff. So going back to kind of the topic of traceability and looking at how, animals are moving. So it is, currently recommended that in general movement of dairy cattle be limited as much as possible. But I know that stopping movement isn't necessarily feasible. So I just kind of want to reiterate and share the measures we do have in place so that we can, kind of quickly paint the picture of where any given animal's moved. So we have our, certificates of veterinary inspection. And so there's assurance there from the veterinarian that they know that the animals aren't showing signs of or have been exposed to an infectious disease. And then with those CVIs, so we as the state receive those. And for dairy cattle specifically, we receive all that information kind of immediately in real time, because based on our state requirements, which is a little above and beyond others, those movements require either an import permit or an electronic CVI. So we get all that information real time, which is helpful if we do need to, quickly trace any animals to notify anyone of potential exposures or whatnot. And this also kind of shows the importance of your record keeping on farm, so we can see where animals came from, where they went, and that Board of Animal Health requires that, certain animal records be kept for 5 years. So keeping good, easily accessible records is going to help you in general. And overall with all of this, with, the implementation of different testing and surveillance and keeping track of anything, it's going to be all about good old communication. So monitoring the situation. And we're very fortunate here in Minnesota that we have kind of consistent and, direct lines of communication with our partners in USDA and US stakeholders. So, we're really going to be here to try and help you through this and protect animal health and meet our missions as an agency.
Thank you, Katie, and we'll let you read through the rest of the document, and that might help us. Right literally, yeah. Everyone, we gave Dr. Cornille the most difficult job. This guidance was released about an hour ago. We planned this webinar last week, and anticipating some of this, but not exactly at this time. So thank you, Dr. Cornille. With that, I will turn it over next to Dr. Nikki Neeser. I will have you introduce yourself, but Dr. Neeser is at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And please do keep the questions coming in. Literally, our doctors are reading the guidance now and might have even better answers or more clear answers by the end. But please keep the questions coming in the question box, and we will do our best to answer them up as we go. Dr. Neeser, please go ahead, and thanks for being
here. All right. Thanks so much, Lucas. I'm having a little trouble with my internet connection, so hopefully it holds out, but just let me know if I need to change something up. So I am Dr. Nikki Neeser. I work at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture as the director of our dairy and meat inspection programs and sort of all things food safety related at the MDA. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the safety of milk, kind of what do we know so far, and some of the topics related to what the FDA has found so far. So the virus has been found in unpasteurized milk from clinically ill cows on affected farms. So we know that this virus sort of likes the mammary gland and thus has been detected in milk from clinically ill cows. These cows are showing signs of mastitis and very much abnormal milk. And so that has been a pretty clear avenue for virus detection. Lots of questions are out there about what about pasteurization? How do we know pasteurization kills the virus? Generally speaking, the message has been that milk is safe, and we continue to emphasize that, we have strong confidence in the pasteurization process. Work is underway to collect the data that is specific to that. As noted a little bit earlier, FDA announced this week detection of genetic fragments of the virus in milk samples that they collected at retail. This is pretty significant in the fact that now we know the virus is present in sort of the commercial milk supply, but it doesn't tell us whether that virus is live or dead. These are PCR tests that essentially just detect those genetic fragments. So FDA basically has provided a few extra details today and yesterday that they detected it in about 1 of 5 samples that they collected, with a higher prevalence of positives in areas where dairy herds were also positive. But it was a national survey, and so samples were positive from different areas around the country. Work is underway to try to demonstrate that these fragments are fragments and not necessarily viable. So some of FDA's research partners, specifically the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, have been trying to grow the virus from those genetic fragments, and thus far have not been able to do so. So that work is underway and continues, but really so far has supported the understanding that pasteurization is effective at killing and inactivating this virus. We also have older studies in related to poultry, so chicken meat, using different kinds of times and temperatures because of the processes involved there, but basically also support and provide additional confidence that pasteurization effectively addresses the virus in the commercial milk supply. Also of note is on these farms, the pasteurized milk ordinance does require, as well as our Minnesota state statutes, require that milk that is adulterated is discarded and does not go into the human food chain. And adulterated milk really is any milk that is abnormal, could contain a harmful substance, or anything that would just really, have an issue with human or really animal health, making sure that milk is discarded. So that's an additional layer of protection for our milk supply. So that leads us a little bit to raw milk. So we've also gotten a lot of questions about the risks around consumption of raw milk. Just covering a little bit on the law in Minnesota. So in Minnesota, our law is that all milk sold for human consumption must be pasteurized, except for milk procured directly at the farm on an occasional basis. And so really we don't allow commercial sales of raw milk, especially to like retail or through grocery stores. People would have to go right to the farm to procure that milk. We are recommending that people avoid consumption of raw milk and raw milk products. This is consistent with our normal recommendation for consumption of raw milk, as raw milk can contain other harmful pathogens such as E. coli or salmonella or other bacteria. So this recommendation really hasn't changed. But we are asking farmers who are selling raw milk to make sure they are hyper aware of the need to hold milk from affected or clinically ill cows out of their food supply or out of their milk that they're selling. We just want to make sure that farmers are really conscious and careful about treating milk from any clinically ill animals appropriately and making sure it's withheld from the food supply. We also in Minnesota have a law that allows the sale of raw milk cheeses that has been aged for 60 days under specific temperature requirements. We don't have a lot of research to know whether influenza would be killed by that process or not. So again, being cautious about consumption of these kind of products, especially if there's a known illness or outbreak happening in a particular herd. And then lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about handling of waste milk. So making sure that, again, adulterated milk can't go into the food supply, human food supply. But then where does adulterated milk go? So we have definitely this can be a challenge. So we have to discard of it somehow. And, first of all, to use the tools that farms have. A lot of farms do already use calf pasteurizers to treat waste milk that is fed back to calves. And so we highly encourage that any milk that is fed back to calves or reused on the farm is heat treated and gone through a pasteurization process if they have those tools available to them. If you have to dispose of larger amounts of waste milk, such as if you have an antibiotic contamination situation, to really be considerate of your neighbors and avoid probably direct field spread of that, probably going into a manure storage situation where there's a longer holding time to give the virus some time to inactivate. We don't have a lot of research or a lot of knowledge about what that process looks like or how many days that is. Most of that research has been done in the avian side. So we have some confidence that the virus can be inactivated. We just don't have the specific details. So again, consider, your neighbors, your dairy farm neighbors, your poultry farm neighbors, as you undergo spreading of any manure that might be affected or waste milk, especially large amounts of that. So we hope to learn more from FDA and the research that they're doing in the coming days and weeks. And so hopefully in the future, we'll be able to share a little bit more concrete information and more details. And with that, back to you, Lucas.
Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Holzbauer from able to join us, please do. And we will hear from you now.
All right. Thank you, Lucas. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, great. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the human health aspects of this situation. I just wanted to back up a little bit and kind of remind folks as to why this situation, is involving so many different species and people and multiple agents. Because influenza is one of those viruses that truly respects no geopolitical state lines, county lines, or species for that matter. And so this particular virus, H5N1, is an influenza A virus. And influenza A viruses are circulating in wild birds, and they're constantly changing. Flu never rests. If there's anything to take home from my presentation, is that it's constantly changing, and we have to keep an open mind about influenzas. And so influenzas A viruses widely circulate in humans, wild birds, domestic birds, and swine, equine, but all of these viruses, including our seasonal influenza viruses that we get vaccinated for every year, have an origin in wild birds at some point in time. And they have what's called an epidemic potential, meaning that because they're constantly changing and swapping genes with each other, we're always worried that the virus may mutate to no longer infect the species that we were initially concerned about, which in this situation was wild birds, but we saw spillover into poultry, and now we've seen spillover into dairy. And so the concern, as we have more mammal to mammal spread, that this virus may mutate where it can then spread to people more easily and spread person to person. And so that is why we are very interested in what's happening from the human health side in both our poultry and dairy industries, because we have people and animals that are in the same environment and working together. And so the fear is that essentially we will have a person who is infected with a human seasonal influenza virus, but then also happens to get infected with the avian H5N1 virus, and those two viruses essentially swap their genes, and then we have this new human virus that then could circulate person to person. And there's this idea that we all kind of live in a bubble, and every once in a while, our different sectors kind of overlap. But really, the reality of influenzas is that they're constantly pushing the envelope, and they're constantly trying to see where they can go and what they can infect. And we've seen that with this virus. It's literally spread from the Arctic to the Antarctic and has spread to over 200 different mammals that have been reported by the USDA. And we've seen massive die-offs of other mammalian species, including elephant seals and fur seals. And so, but when we look at the human risk for these viruses, really we have to go back to poultry, because that's where we have most of the information about how these viruses act in people. And so avian influenza viruses are essentially spread to people through direct contact with usually infected birds or their environment. And so person-to-person spread of these viruses is rare and limited. We expect there to be occasional spillover for the people who have direct contact, especially with poultry, but we don't see person-to-person spread. And so it's not a risk to the general public, and it's not a food safety risk either. And so the role of the Minnesota Department of Health in these situations, both in poultry and if we would have a positive dairy herd in Minnesota, is to protect human health and to support our responding animal health agencies. And so what we do is we monitor the health of people that are in direct contact with infected birds. And if we did have a positive herd in Minnesota, direct contact with dairy cattle as well. And we provide human health information and risk assessments to the industry and the public. And so in our poultry response, because this is a programmed disease, we have an official role in the incidence response structure as the human disease surveillance officers. And so what that means is that we provide a public health perspective to our animal health colleagues. And so as previously mentioned, we're in constant communication with each other and sharing our different perspectives. But for the industry, we interview the poultry workers and those persons that are responding to positive flocks. And we ask about their work duties, the types of personal protective equipment that they wear, and any illness history. And then we initiate active surveillance for 10 days following the last known exposure. In poultry, that's usually easy to calculate because poultry are being depopulated. And so that it would be the last day of exposure. And then we monitor folks for respiratory symptoms for 10 days. With dairy, it's a little more nebulous because we're learning what this disease looks like in dairy. And so at this point in time, our guidance is to monitor people for 10 days, essentially after clinical signs are, after the cows have recovered in the herd. And so that would be our process if we did have a positive herd here in Minnesota. And then any person that reports any symptoms that are consistent, essentially respiratory symptoms or conjunctivitis, we would ask them to voluntarily be tested for H5N1 and any other seasonal circulating respiratory viruses. And so again, going back to poultry, since this virus first appeared in Minnesota in the spring of 2022, we've monitored over 1,000 individuals that were exposed to the 154 positive premises. And we've been able to interview 65% of those folks, and 83% of them had direct contact with infected poultry, were considered at risk. And so of those 1,000, we have tested 25 people who reported symptoms, and we detected one person with a seasonal human influenza virus, and the rest, we had 8 positive people, one with a human influenza virus, and the rest had other seasonal circulating respiratory viruses. So no H5N9 and 1 positive reports. And so I'm sharing how we approach poultry to essentially give you a sense of what our approach would be in dairy, because the recommendations for these mammalian spillover events are essentially the same. So our PPE recommendations are the same for dairy cattle or other mammals that test positive, and our monitoring and testing recommendations are the same. And so, the recommendations for people on dairy farms who are in direct contact with ill cattle are for them to be wearing gloves, goggles, N95 masks, coveralls, and boots. And we know that these PPE recommendations are difficult, especially in operations where this is not normal types of personal protective equipment. And certainly we see the same issues in our poultry industry as well. And the PPE recommendations are the same. We see about 23% of the people that we monitor have actually worn the full PPE the entire time while they were working with infected birds. But the key message, though, is to protect those mucous membranes, your eyes, your nose, your mouth. We want to make sure that we're keeping any fluids that may be carrying the virus, out of those types of things. And so we recognize that people will make decisions, having fogged up goggles when you're driving a skid steer, can be an issue, but we do want to protect those mucous membranes as much as we can. And then just to give a bit more background on the human infection that was identified in Texas on April 1st, as was previously mentioned, this is the only person at this point in time that has been positive with contact with dairy cattle. And mammalian transfer events of these avian influenza viruses are even more rare than transfer events from poultry to people. There's only been one other documented mammal to person event, which was a positive cat in the United States, which was a different influenza virus than H7N6. And so, but we're still concerned because we have to keep an open mind with these viruses, which is why we're monitoring people. And so this dairy worker who was tested positive is essentially the 13th reported person worldwide who has been found to be infected with this virus. The virus at this point in time does not show any molecular evidence that it's more likely to infect humans. But again, it's something that our CDC colleagues are constantly monitoring the viruses that are circulating both in cattle and poultry and looking for those molecular indicators that say that it may be more likely to infect people. And they're not seeing that at this point. States that have positive herds have been monitoring folks as well. And at this point in time, the latest numbers that I've heard is that there have been 44 exposed people that have been monitored on infected farms and 22 persons that had that were symptomatic were tested, but no additional positive tests other than the one person in Texas. And so again, the risk to the public remains low, and it really remains an occupational risk to those people who have prolonged unprotected exposure to infected birds, infected cattle, or other mammals that are positive. And so our recommendations still remain the same for this virus, whether it's poultry, dairy cattle, or other animals that are infected, to wear the recommended PPE, protect those mucous membranes, monitor your health for 10 days following last exposure, and then testing if you develop any respiratory signs or conjunctivitis. And then in addition, as Dr. Neeser had mentioned, we also are recommending to not consume raw milk or raw milk products from suspected affected herds, but that also fits with our ongoing public health messages related to raw milk for concerns for other pathogens as well. And with that, I'll stop and just remind folks that influenza viruses are constantly changing, and once we think we have them figured out, they make fools out of us, and so they really are unpredictable. So we do need this One Health approach and sensibility to approach influenza surveillance and a coordinated response. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Holzbauer. Appreciate that. So that's the end of our formal speakers. So we'll start heading through the Q&A. And first, based on the Q&A, a theme I'm seeing, I just want Dr. Cornille, if you're available, to redefine or remind us, in other words, of what is required for intrastate, or in our case, within Minnesota travel. If you're going all the way across the state with cattle, what are requirements and what are recommendations today for things within our border?
Within, okay. Sorry, I'm just gonna pull up some things so I can give direct quotes. So as always, there we go. Breeding cattle and cattle for exhibition must be officially identified upon movement from their herd to another location, unless they're going to a federally approved market, slaughtering establishment, or one of our 3 slaughter-only handling facilities. The records still need to be maintained for animals that are purchased, traded, dealt, sold, disposed of. So any acquisition or disposition of cattle should be maintained by the producer for intrastate movements as well. So that's going to be all the same. So there's not anything new for the intra-state movements. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. So just to be clear, if you can say yes or no, the new federal order from USDA does not change any current requirements within travel within the state of Minnesota. Is that correct?
Correct. It does not. There are recommendations in terms of, limiting movement. If you have animals with clinical signs, do not move them off the premises. And I feel like that's pretty general. Like, we would generally, as an agency, recommend that too. And, it's not a new requirement, but just kind of the reminder of additional biosecurity and keeping that in mind when doing any sort of movements. So.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes.
Cornille. To give you a break, I'll actually go back to Dr. Armstrong. Joe, can you talk about certificates of veterinary inspection, required testing? Now that you've maybe had a second chance to read through the document, what do you think farmers should know for getting across state lines, and what does it take? And if any of the other veterinarians, I think you're all veterinarians, any other doctors, veterinarians have a chance or want to weigh in, please do. But Joe, just what should farmers know about CVI's interstate or across state line shipment and required testing?
Yeah, so I had the advantage of going first, so I've had a chance to read through this thing again. So the big thing is that we need samples to be collected and results within 7 days of movement. So that's the first thing to know. We know that USDA is saying that we're going to have test results back from a non-lab in 1 to 3 days. And then if there's confirmatory testing needed, they're going to take an additional 1 to 2 days to do that. So as far as talking to our diagnostic lab and conversations I've had with them, they're not concerned about the volume and should be able to handle it. After that, so we got to be within 7 days of movement. If you have 30 or fewer animals, every single animal needs to have a test. If you have a group that is 30 or more, then 30 animals in that group need to be tested. And that's based on statistics and kind of stolen from our pig colleagues. And that might change as we learn more about this virus. But for now, if you have 30 or less, you need every animal tested. If you have 30 or more, then 30 animals of that group need to be tested. The biggest question, so samples need to be, like Katie was saying, need to be collected by an accredited veterinarian or under the direct supervision of an accredited veterinarian to ensure that the samples come from the cows that are actually moving. What happens if you have a positive test? That's the big question, right? So the biggest question is, what do you do if you have a positive test? Well, it is reportable. And I would add to the federal order also shows that not only PCR testing is reportable, serological testing is also reportable. So we have to be conscious of the fact that even if you run serology positives are also reportable. If you get a positive test, any sample that tests positives and basically shuts that premise down for 30 days. Cattle that are not allowed and not eligible for interstate movement, across state lines for 30 days. Okay. It does not mean, as far as what I'm reading, correct me if I'm wrong, Katie and others, they are not eligible for interstate movement. That does not mean they can't move inside the state. I'll read it again to make sure that I'm right, but I'm pretty sure that's what it says. So they're not eligible for interstate movement for 30 days. If they want to move interstate after that 30 days is up, then they have to be tested again. As far as I can tell, those are the basics. The biggest one, and one that I think we have to thank our Board of Animal Health and our state veterinarians for fighting for, is our cull cattle movements. Cull cattle going directly to slaughter are going to need a CVI, but they do not need a test. That is something I know that our state veterinarians are fighting for, and that's a massive deal. And it's a big deal. It's an animal welfare issue. And so the fact that they do not need a test to go to slaughter is huge. As far as I know, that is the highlights. Katie, you got an additions?
Yeah, something that I'll want to clarify after reading it through one more time. It says, a CVI or other documentation of movement approved by the sending and receiving state. So that's something that we as a state will have to figure out how to address, because currently, like, generally a CVI isn't required for animals to be moved directly to slaughter. So that will be, a change in training for my staff and in change in our import requirements in general temporarily. And so I'll need to, consult with our directors to confirm what that looks like for Minnesota. So that's one of my questions from it. So TBD.
Thank you both. And we're not going to be able to answer, every single question here today, but we're going to try to hit the highlights here at this early hour, and we'll continue to get out more information in case we don't. But please do keep sending your questions. Next one I'll put forth to probably Katie and Joe, whoever wants to take it. There have been no new official positive birds for 1 week. So how would you interpret that development? No new declared positive birds.
There's all sorts of reasons for that. One of the reasons is USDA is slow. Okay, so that's one of the reasons, right? So USDA is slow, and the slower they get is usually because of how high up the chain they need to go to get approval to release information. So in this situation, things are likely going all the way up the chain. I mean, all the way to the top, White House. So things are just slow. That's my first interpretation. As we think about the other things that we're talking about, until the guidance of this document, there was no way to get out of the box. If you had a positive test, you had no way and no plan for how you resume normal business. So I would find it really hard to voluntarily test my animals if that was the case, because I didn't have a way to get out of that. There was no plan for what would happen next. So that would be my second interpretation of that question. And I think that's the two main reasons for why we haven't seen a positive in the last week.
Thank you. Next question. I know Stacy's actively answering another question online, but if you have the chance to come off mute, or we can skip to the next one. Dr. Holzbauer, what is the risk or recommendation for having non-agriculture human visitors on your farm? Anything changing there specifically for humans visiting your dairy farm?
So just to make sure I understood the question, the risk for having non-agriculture, so people who haven't had contact with potentially infected poultry or dairy. So again, the risk at this point is very low for the general public. This virus is not being transmitted amongst people at this point in time. And again, the human surveillance part of this is really just monitoring, because the potential is there. But I would not be concerned about people that haven't had direct contact with animals that are infected. And I'm not a Zoom person, so I think I screwed up my chance to answer Katie's question. So I'll just answer it verbally. So it's the 13th person to be infected with this specific clade of H5N1, the 233 4B, but there's actually been 26 people that have been reported globally infected with H5N1 since January of 2022. But that also includes the clade of H5N1 that's been circulating in Southeast Asia for a long time.
Thank you, Stacy. I just want to jump in with a statement from Dr. Hayes, our state veterinarian. He says, just a perspective statement for all to consider. Minnesota only regulates imports to our state. So each state will have its own, potentially slightly different interpretation of the federal. So contact our state health officials, especially for importation or if you have questions, but also the state you're going to is going to be verifying their own import requirements. So again, if you are sending to one of our other states, that state will be verifying, determining the import requirements. And I will just say, our state veterinarians from all of our surrounding states have certainly been talking. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Cornille have regularly told me they are, without getting specific. They're on the same page and trying to work together to keep our industry moving. Next question I wanted to ask is, I think we'll go back to testing requirements. And this was asked to Joe, and I think you're answering it also. But just specifically on the testing requirements, all 4 quarters of milk. Can you just explain the process? How long you think it would take?
Right. Who
Who needs to do it? Anything with taking the milk samples, Dr. Armstrong?
Yeah. So the milk samples were the silver lining is that we're not looking for a bacteria. We're not trying to culture anything. We're trying to get something with PCR. So you don't have to be clean. I mean, okay, so don't take that the wrong way. You should be clean when you touch the udder in any way. Okay. But we don't have to be as careful as we would for, let's say, mastitis sampling. We're looking for PCR results. We do have evidence, though, that the virus is in some quarters, but not others in the same cow. So we need one composite sample, but that sample must contain milk from all 4 quarters. You don't have to individually sample quarters, but you need to get all 4 quarters in one sample. Hopefully that clears that up.
Thank you. Dr. Holzbauer, we'll go back to you for this one. If farmers or workers are looking for protective equipment, is the local store the best place to get that? Or is there anywhere else we can get personal protective equipment if farms or workers are concerned about that?
Sure. No, your local hardware stores should have the personal protective equipment available there. And again, tieback suits are recommended, but if you have other, kind of waterproof coveralls or, assigned chore clothes that you're changing out of before you go home to your family, and things like that, that's fine as well. But that said, if people are finding it hard to get personal protective equipment, you can reach out to us. We do have some available in our stockpile if needed, if we can demonstrate that you're not able to get it through routine places.
I think this is for you, Dr. Armstrong, but obviously Dr. Cornille or Dr. Neeser. Any supportive therapy recommendations on sick cows? So if your cows are sick, is there some go-to recommendations on treatment at this point?
So in talking to the farms that have been impacted and talking to the owners of those farms, what has been working best is this is viral. remember. So we're not going to have antibiotics really play a role unless we have a secondary infection. Primary treatment is going to be supportive care only. That is going to be hydration primarily, and then ruminal support. And then often that includes some kind of drench mix. What people have been using that seems to work the best is anything that we would think about giving a fresh cow that has some kind of energy supplementation in it as well. So think like blue light, YMCP, those kind of things that we would give fresh cows, added to the drench. That is what we're doing primarily, is just drenching cows. And you can imagine that's a lot of work if you have a 5,000 cow dairy and you're drenching 250 cows a day. But that's what needs to be done to get through this and to stay ahead of it from a supportive care standpoint. I am a big believer in adding NSAIDs to that regimen. As far as how to do that, a combination, aspirin is an option because you're drenching them anyway. But the effectiveness of aspirin is questionable. So if we know we're going to be pulling them out of the tank, I think the best compromise of cost, ease of use, and how fast you can get it done is probably transdermal Banamine at this point. And then you just have to pay attention to meat and milk withholds when you do that. So that would be my biggest recommendations. It's hydration, ruminal support, and then NSAIDs.
Anyone else? Otherwise, the next question I see, I'm not sure. We do have fantastic researchers at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Cardona is one. We considered adding her to this webinar. I said, let's keep it on what to do now. So that's my fault that she's not here. So I'm not sure if someone can answer this, but do we know if this virus can live on equipment and can be transferred via milk trucks, feed trucks, others? So I'm not sure if someone can answer that here. If not,
I could take
go
a
ahead,
stab
Joe.
at what at least I know. So we know that the biggest problem in transferring this virus around is milk. It's not the only problem, but it's the biggest problem. So yes, spilled milk and actual milk is a big deal. So having a plan for how you're going to handle that and how you're going to minimize traffic in the milk house is a good idea. That's easier said than done. I totally understand that. But that's all I know at this time. Can it live on equipment? Potentially, but I don't know for how long. We have none of that information for this specific virus. And again, like Lucas said, there's probably a better person to answer that question. There's considerations you should be taking anyway, I think, from a biosecurity standpoint, as far as making sure that we are minimizing the routes that trucks take on our farm so they don't overlap with on-farm traffic as much as possible. I'm not overly concerned about feed trucks and that kind of traffic, but we do have to be paying attention to spilled milk and milk that potentially can move around by mechanical means.
Thank you. Next question, there's two kind of related questions about the storage of samples and how fast they need to be to the lab. So first question might be, if you're on DHI or DHIA, can those samples be sent right to the non-lab by the DHI lab? So that was one question. Then the second question I alluded to, do these things need to be overnighted? How fast do we need to get the samples? If you are doing the sample, what is the storage method to shipping method to getting them to the lab?
So getting milk samples to the lab, what we're talking with the diagnostic lab is, because it's PCR, nothing has to be alive for us to have a good enough test. So does it have to be overnight? If the diagnostic lab got to choose, they would say absolutely, we'd love to have it overnight. But we understand the costs associated with that. So I do not believe it needs to be overnight. It needs to get there in a timely manner, and the quicker it gets there, the quicker you can move cattle. But it should be on ice, just to make sure those samples stay cold. We don't have overgrowth of something that could interfere with the PCR testing. But no, it doesn't need to be overnight. On ice, in a closed container, so that that closed container, we all know those pop open. That needs to be inside something else that cannot leak out of the package you're sending it in.
Thank you. Joe, you mentioned USDA, they have a protocol, and sometimes that takes time. If a farmer is in a situation where they're seeing symptoms and testing, Does anyone have any comment on notifying neighbors, dairy or poultry? Anything you would recommend the farmer did different if they are in that waiting phase, or after it's confirmed positive? Does anyone have recommendations on that? I think that's something we're working on, as was alluded to by State Veterinarian Dr. Hafes this morning, but was just curious if there's anything we should give at this.
Sorry, just to clarify your question, Lucas, you're wondering what to do while you wait for tests?
Or once it's confirmed.
Or once it's confirmed. So, yes, I mean, we need to be conscious of our impact on our neighbors as well. And the goal is to minimize the circulation of this virus as much as possible, so you can return to business as fast as possible. If we continue to add new animals to a population where we know we have a positive and we have symptomatic animals, this virus can continue to circulate once we have naive animals introduced to the population. So if you continue to add new animals, you will extend your time that you are going to have a problem. That is something that we are working on. In addition to these pre-movement testing requirements, we need to know how to make that 30 days shorter, if at all possible, and provide data to USDA to show that we can have other criteria to meet so we can get out of the box sooner. That's the goal. I think I skipped a question from you last time, Lucas, about DHIA and moving those milk samples directly from DHIA. I have no idea. That's a question for DHIA, and they will likely be in contact with the labs. The problem is that those samples, I don't know if they're count as being under the direct supervision and collected by a veterinarian. So I would say that initially my answer is going to be no, and that will have to be confirmed. I think I answered your other question, right, Lucas? Oh, and
Yes.
while we're waiting for results, it's really easy to say that you should separate those animals that need to move and wait for results for those potentially 5 to 7 days. I realize that that's not entirely possible. Okay, it is ideal, but not always possible. So that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you. Dr. Neeser, if you're available, next questions would go to you, but of course others can chime in. We had 2 questions on milk movement, one about raw milk across state lines, and the second one about movement in general. Are you available, Dr. Neeser? Yeah, so the questions are, can you move raw milk across state lines, and are there any restrictions on commercial milk movement in general across state lines?
Yeah, so I think 2 different scenarios there. One would be if an individual from another state drives to a farm in Minnesota and picks up raw milk that they're going to bring to their home back for their own personal consumption, and that would be allowed on an occasional basis by Minnesota statutes. In the other situation, I think that is being asked about is, can bulk milk hauler pick up milk from a Minnesota farm and haul that to a plant or a different destination in another state? And the answer to that is yes, that can be done. And in fact, is done very often in terms of bulk milk, as long as it is intended for pasteurization. So it's going to a milk plant where they're going to then pasteurize that and turn that into bottled milk or ice cream or cheese or another dairy product.
Thank you. And while we have you, any concern about aerosolized milk from a milk truck? Maybe that's not your department, but since it was a milk question, thought I'd go to you first.
Sure. Yeah. I think as was noted earlier, milk is kind of the big concern. That's where we've been finding virus. And so certainly aerosolized milk could potentially contain virus on an affected farm. And so we want to be careful to make sure, we're cleaning equipment and vehicles that touch milk well, or cleaning them and sanitizing them, making sure we're doing a good job to not contaminate driveways and things where vehicles and people and equipment could get contaminated. And so that would include aerosol, can't even say that word, milk that kind of gets aerosolized in the process. So.
Thank you. Well, we have answered all the questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any others covering the broad spectrum we have here. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to remind everyone that the federal order from USDA covers cattle, only cattle going across state lines, and we've kind of differentiated which cattle it affects. We've got recommendations interstate. We have not seen any change in milk movement. We have further recommendations there. But again, this new order is for lactating dairy cattle across state lines, or as we call it, interstate movement. With that, I think we will wrap up this recording for today. This will be available soon on the website. As the need arises, we'll continue to communicate. I want to thank our doctors, Armstrong, Cornille, Neeser, and Holzbauer, as well as the Board of Animal Health, University of Minnesota Extension, State Department of Agriculture, for just making yourselves available. We will continue to communicate as Minnesota Milk, and I know these departments will as well. Anything else, panelists, before we sign off? Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, everyone.